Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, October 9th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, our monthly tech commentary columnist, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, former editor of Popular Mechanics, and a former top honcho, Wallenda, as they used to call them, at Entertainment Weekly, which may come up a little bit today. James B. Meggs. Jim, nice to have you, as always.
Great to be back.
Okay, so Kamala Harris had a big day yesterday in which she appeared on Howard Stern's show and on The View and on Late Night with Stephen Colbert, and I believe had the most inadvertently revealing and largest mistake you could possibly make in the history of anything. No, I mean, it's a little much. It's not as bad as saying I will raise your taxes the way Walter Mondale did, but asked in the softest interview atmosphere possible by the softest interviewer she could possibly have had, Sunny Hostin, asked if there was anything she would have done differently from Joe Biden, said she couldn't think of a thing.
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
And she added, I was involved, or I contributed to most of the major decisions.
So I'm bringing this up only to say that now we know we keep getting reasons thrown at us every 5 minutes why they won't let her talk to anybody. Because the simplest thing to say is Joe Biden's a great president, great man. He saved us from Trump. You know, he brought us unprecedented low unemployment, and the stock market is booming, and there's all sorts of wonderful things. But look, like everybody, he's made mistakes. We've made mistakes. We got the border. We've finally gotten the border policy right, but maybe we got the border policy a little wrong. And I'm going to fix that. Like, that is not a hard hand to play. Like, and you can even do it implicitly the way George H.W. Bush did in 1988 when he was running essentially to be the third term of Ronald Reagan, but tried to divide himself from Reagan a little bit by saying we need to be a kinder, gentler nation, which was an implicit criticism of the hard-charging, overly competitive, capitalist, harsh, whatever, to appeal to women or something like that. So there's a way to do it. She has the entire Democratic Party, the liberal establishment, every person from, the right of center anti-Trumpers to the far left in her camp, giving her advice, proffering things, and she still, every single time she opens her mouth, says something bad or unhelpful to her own cause. And this, I think, was the worst yet. This is like $100 million campaign ad for Trump. There's nothing she would have done differently in the last 3.5 years, speaking to a country in which 70% of people still think that we're on the wrong track. What am I missing here?
Well, I would modify your or largely on target take. I don't know that it's the worst thing she's ever done, because I still don't know that American voters' biggest problem with Biden is his policy record. I maintain that it's Biden, the guy, and his deficiencies, and his other shortcomings as a reliable person in the Oval Office. And I also think if they're increasingly revealed, that would be American voters' biggest problem with Kamala Harris. And I think when she can't answer a question, when she can't string thoughts together, when she's very obviously insecure about her ability to do the job, I think those are when she makes the worst mistakes. But I could be wrong. It's neck and neck between the record she's involved with and is now embraced and tied herself to, and who she is as a person.
One
Okay,
thing I've
look,
noticed over the past couple of days about her, what she's done is that I had said earlier, I remember in the campaign that she was benefiting, and I still think this is true to some extent. She was benefiting from the fact that it wasn't really clear who was president and who was, do we have a president and whatever. She could always say, well, I support the president in his efforts to get a ceasefire and leave it at that. Things like that. She could always pass the buck to Biden because Biden was technically president. But the past couple of days, I think, have also shown us how she's struggling a bit with the setup because she wanted to look presidential for the hurricane and was like, I tried to call Ron DeSantis and he won't take my calls and all this. And DeSantis was like, I don't know if that's true, but I don't know why I would be speaking to the vice president on something like this. And then Biden was like, well, I picked up the phone. I called Ron. Yeah, he picked up on 2 rings. He's a great guy. Me and Ron, we go way back. So there was like this, there are times when she wants to step into that role, the commander-in-chief role already, and times when she wants to be able to hold off on it. And I think she's mistiming her plays in both of those.
But you know who didn't mistime his play? Biden, who aired that briefing right when she was appearing on The View, once again kind of preempting the vice president's, media moment during her campaign.
He has basically been saying implicitly now for a week, don't think that I am on the ice floe. I am still on the shore and I can get to the microphone anytime I want to. And you tried to put me on the ice floe, and I kind of agreed that I would go onto the ice floe when all was said and done. But I am not happy with your efforts to act as though I am on the ice floe now. And it ain't no Viking funeral for me just yet, madam. It is a very interesting psychological dynamic that is going on between the two of them.
We should add also that she was asked the exact same question by Stephen Colbert. Would you do anything different? And her answer then was much longer, but much less coherent. So this is a question that one would expect if you're a sitting vice president running with a guy whose, record is spotty. She's not prepared to answer this.
Right.
She drank a beer, so she's very authentic.
This is her Achilles heel, the way that for Vance and for Republicans, do you accept that Biden won the 2020 election is the Achilles heel question that they cannot figure out an answer to, except to say Biden became president, and that happened, and we had a peaceful transfer of power on the 20th of January, and please let me keep speaking until I bore you so that you'll ask me a different question, because I don't know how to answer this question in any way that is helpful to me, my cause, or anything like that, right? So, but again, she has $100 trillion, and every single person in the Democratic political establishment rooting for her, wanting her to win, coming up with memos that are flying into Wilmington on what she should do, how she should say, what she should say, lines from every comedian in America, lines from every speechwriter in America. And she cannot come up with a coherent answer to the question, what would you have done differently? And it would be a human thing to say, look, we're not perfect. We weren't perfect. No one's perfect. We made mistakes. And I'm learning from the mistakes. And I am going to be a different president from Joe Biden. And I have the advantage of having watched it, seen the mistakes, and with some capacity to correct the mistakes. Now, Abe, I want to differ from you in one sense, because I do agree that Biden's infirmity is obviously the central reason that he isn't the person running right now. But we do have a new poll out, or a new survey out from Gallup. And here's what the survey says. The economy ranks as the most important of 22 issues that U.S. registered voters say will influence their choice for president, right? Not surprising. But the number is huge. It is the only issue on which a majority of voters, 52%, say the candidates' positions on it are, quote, an extremely important influence on their vote. Another 38% rate it as very important, which means the issue could be a significant factor to 9 in 10 voters, and voters view Donald Trump as better able than Kamala Harris to handle the economy 54 to 45. He has a 9-point advantage in this survey that finds that at a minimum, 52% say that it's an extraordinarily important factor in their vote. And at a maximum, close to 90% say it's important to very important. And he's got a 9% gain. And she's asked, is there anything you would do differently? And she says, I can't think of anything. And, you know, I'm not even saying she should say, I would do X, Y, and Z different at the border here to follow this line. She's got to say something on the economy that she would do differently.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think it's like I said, in my mind, it's neck and neck, because if it is among the big, if it's the biggest mistake she made, then so is her general inability to answer questions about what she would do for the economy and for prices, which I think is part of what people are talking about when they talk about the economy. Their inability to pay new higher prices. So she's bad. She's bad on that front all around.
She's also reminding me a little bit more of the way she behaved when she was a candidate in the primary last time, where she was also vague. And we should recall one of the reasons that she might, to your question, John, of like, how is she not doing better with these obvious questions? She's notorious for churning through staff, in part because she refused to read what the staff would brief her to do. There was a kind of, whether that was out of laziness, whether that was out of, you know, a sense of I don't need to be briefed, whatever the motivation. She has this reputation as a senator. She had it as a candidate before, but her vagueness and kind of almost even the way she's moving her hands and eyes remind me of a couple of the moments during that primary right before she dropped out, where she just seemed kind of like a deer in headlights. She didn't know what to do. And that is what I'm reminded of in in this media blitz the last couple of days. I see hints of that again.
Okay.
What I can't understand is the contrast between the obvious preparation and memorization she did for the debate, where she had a lot of good lines and she, you know, stayed on her game pretty well. You know, certainly in contrast to a lot of the you know, less scripted interviews. And why didn't they just learn from that and say, okay, every day, you know, you need to spend an hour in prep for whatever public statements are coming up? Because again and again and again, I think, Christine, you said that, or one of you said that she has the look of someone, you know, asked to stand up and deliver a book report on a book she hasn't read. And, you know, and that she would have that answer to the question, what you would do differently. It's the number one question any candidate gets asked, and that she's still not ready for it. It just mystifies me.
By the way, you know, the other thing about campaigns classically is that they follow the pattern of the news. This is something from, the ancient prehistoric days in which Jim Meigs and I were involved in old-fashioned news gathering when there was a 6:30 newscast that people were trying to get at the top of, or the morning newspaper or something like that. Obviously, a totally different era, but the idea was that you tried to dominate the question that was at the forefront of the consciousness of people as a result of the news of the day. So you spoke to the news of the day while remaining disciplined about your message, or you attempted to make news every day, as George H.W. Bush did in 1988 by going to flag factories and doing the Pledge of Allegiance and doing things, creating media events, the purpose of which was to highlight the differences between him and his rival in a way that redounded to his benefit. And she is doing none of that. In fact, she is running away from the main issue that is dominating the American news, and we should talk about this now because it's also a particular specialty of Jim Meigs's, and that is not only the response to Hurricane Helene, but the coming response to Hurricane Milton, this two-barreled assault on the southeast of the United States, that is going to play a perhaps entirely definitive role in who becomes the next president of the United States, as the effect of Helene right now is largely on the swing states of Georgia and North Carolina. North Carolina not having been really one of the states that we thought might decide the election, but Harris started pulling very close to Trump in these numbers, and there was this terrible gubernatorial candidate who was polling 15 points behind the Democrat and the Republican Party, and then the hurricane just like smashes into North Carolina unexpectedly. Georgia is still reeling from Helene. This is going to scramble all sorts of efforts to get out early vote and voting, and there's no power in vast swaths of the south central parts of North Carolina, and aside from the general desperate desire of the mainstream media to connect this to climate change, and sort of pull away from the actual simple fact of how is the response going, and how are we supposed to measure the response? She's running away from it like she is Jesse Owens, and I don't or
now that's a dated reference.
That's not only dated. That's dated. He was 25. He won the gold medal 25 years before I was born yet. So I don't know who is like a runner now. I don't even know. Some Kenyan guy. I don't even know. So Jim, let's talk a little about this. So hurricane preparedness and the political response to hurricanes has been a extraordinarily potent political issue in the United States for now going on 30 some odd years, since Hurricane Andrew in 1992, I would say.
Yeah, and this is something that I actually covered quite a bit, not through a political lens, but more through an infrastructure emergency management lens when I was at Popular Mechanics. The first time I ever saw New Orleans was on a reporting trip for Popular Mechanics about what went wrong after Katrina, and I took a tour of the city in a National Guard Black Hawk helicopter. When about 3 weeks after the storm, it had a huge impact on me. And what I learned on that trip was that a lot of the media's framing of what happened in Katrina was just completely backwards. And of course, the media didn't question at all that anything that went wrong in the hurricane was the result of George Bush's, either ineptitude or active racism against the residents of New Orleans. In fact, the rescue efforts and a lot of what went on there was pretty good by the standards of other hurricanes, given the scale of that disaster. But you never heard that story. And instead, what everyone remembers is how potent the storyline was. If you can tie the death and destruction of a hurricane to a sitting president, that is an enormously potent way to tar their reputation, somewhat permanently in his case. So what we see in the aftermath of Helene is the press kind of running cover for the administration and explaining that complaints about FEMA being slow and stuff like that are all misinformation or disinformation. But what's complicated about this is that hurricanes are complicated. It's all too easy to come up with a black and white storyline about, either government incompetence or this or that. In fact, it is hard to get, resources to people stranded on some mountaintop in a rural mountainous area. There's reasons why these things don't happen overnight. The expectations in Katrina that FEMA was going to land a helicopter in everybody's yard with a pallet of water, they were just unrealistic. And some of the expectations today are unrealistic. And there is some wild conspiracy theory. I don't know if people remember the conspiracy theory about FEMA camps, that FEMA was getting ready to put us all in concentration camps, according to Alex Jones. So there's a lot of craziness around this. But what I find really striking so far is the media's tone in covering this is basically to apologize or deflect criticisms of the feds and question the stories of, in many cases, people on the ground. Some of those stories are a little inflated, but others aren't.
Okay, so let's go into this. So what I'm hearing from people that I know who live in and around there is that, as is traditional in these cases, and as a subject that you have repeatedly written about in commentary since starting to write your column for commentary, is that the self-generated citizen response to disasters and calamities is always astonishing in its depth, in its scope, in the generosity of people who have not been hit so hard, in doing everything they can to help their neighbors. It's sort of Tocqueville's idea of America made manifest. The little platoons of democracy that can, that take care of each other in a self-governing republic, and that seems very much to be happening here. And similarly, you have, from the top down, you have a remarkable moment in the White House press room when Fox's Peter Doocy asked Karine Jean-Pierre a question about the response in some fashion or other. And she said, that question is disinformation. And Doocy said, a question cannot be disinformation. I'm asking you a question. You answer the question, and then you can say that information that I am using in the question is wrong because here's why or something, but it's a question. And that decision, which has been followed not only by Karine Jean-Pierre, but by the head of FEMA and by local authorities, the mayor of Asheville, North Carolina, and others, is to say that people who are questioning the response are participating in a disinformation campaign, which therefore discredits anything that they might be saying, is like the new patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. You just use the word disinformation when you're asked uncomfortable questions.
But it's worse than that, though, because part of the problem, particularly after Helene, is that in the Carolinas and in Georgia, those regions, as Jim said, that are quite remote and were hit, reporters weren't going there either. The national media wanted to ignore the story, I think exactly as Jim says, because it might reflect badly on the current administration. They don't report. And then when people on the ground or people nearby start sort of saying what they think is going on, then the mainstream media or Karine Jean-Pierre point to them and say, how dare you spread misinformation? Well, there is no information because the media is not doing its job either. So I feel like there's a sort of catch-22 for people who actually do try to share information, or people like Doocy who are trying to question what's actually going on.
Jim, you said you went on a boat. Yeah, you took this, basically a governmental tour of New Orleans and its surroundings in 2005. In 1992, the mainstream media were so rich that during Hurricane Andrew, which was, in which southern Florida was so devastated that, the entire way in which buildings are built in the Southeast was utterly transformed instantaneously to prevent the kinds of things from happening that happened in the wake of that storm and that devastation. Mainstream was so rich, they were chartering 747s to fly over things and like commandeering private aircraft all over America so that they could show you what was going on in every nook and cranny. And now media are poor. I know this sounds weird to people, don't really understand this, but media organizations have a tenth of the money that they used to have to play with and all of that. And one of the reasons that we don't know what's going on in these more rural areas is that the networks aren't spending the money, and there are no news magazines to spend the money, and there's no one to spend the money. to get a helicopter to fly out to, one of these ring counties outside of Asheville to see what's going on. And what's more, when they do that, those people then end up becoming part of the relief effort also, because they can show relief workers where people are who are suffering. They expose it, they show it, and then FEMA can go in. It's not just that you're relying on FEMA to somehow have 100% knowledge of what's going on. How can FEMA know? There's no power. They don't have, what are they supposed to use? Like magical spy satellites to see people hanging on roofs?
So there's also a totally different way that we get information and footage of these events now, which is from individuals on social media, which does contribute to misinformation because some of those are fakes. But we'll see things like, weather services, helicopters flying into hurricanes, and they'll release it. So the incentives for the media in terms of finding out and how to find out and where to go when something like this happens have changed entirely. So then the media seizes on social media and builds stories out of that.
But that also doesn't work now because there's no power. So if you have an iPhone, your iPhone is out of juice. You see, like there isn't a lot of, and Elon Musk had to go in to try to help set up Starlink, which is his private kind of satellite internet access system, in order to provide people with some way of connecting to the outside world that wasn't, current defined by the current electrical grid. But it's not clear to me that anybody with an iPhone is in a position to use their iPhone to get information out.
But it's a mix, John, because there are, people have generators. Your neighbor has a generator. You go charge up your phone. Cell phone service was wiped out for a while, but has kind of been coming back in a spotty fashion. And so there's certainly a lot of interesting footage coming out of these self-organized rescue efforts, and some of it's being dubbed misinformation. Some of it is, but there's a lot of really positive stuff. I think one other change we're seeing in the media is there was a time when a story like this was a story, like what's happening. And today, everything's been nationalized. So the story is framed on what does it mean for our national politics. And that creates all kinds of incentives for the media to either cover it or not cover it and how they cover it. So, when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I'm certainly not relying just on the mainstream media, but I'm also looking at some of the stuff on social media with a certain amount of skepticism to see what can be confirmed. What's good and what's really exciting, as you said, these platoons of volunteers. We saw this in Katrina. I think that story was undercovered. People literally showed up with their own private helicopters and were rescuing people off of roofs. All these southern fishing guides and sportsmen showed up with their own boats, and they were taking these flatboats
like Dunkirk.
Yeah, seriously, through the streets of New Orleans, literally rescuing people. The media wasn't terribly interested in that story. It got covered a little. But we're seeing a lot of this happening here, and we're seeing there's something like 400 private helicopters in western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee that have been flying missions to try to rescue people, and all kinds of relief efforts that are organized locally, and church groups and others from outside the area surging supplies in. So a lot has happened that's very positive. And we've seen a little bit of that phenomenon. I wrote about, I think 4 years ago, I did a story for Commentary about the big Alaska earthquake in 1962. And this phenomenon that we've talked about before on the podcast of elite panic, where when there's some kind of chaotic situation or disaster, people in positions of authority often worry first that the public will react with panic or chaos or disorganization. And so the first thing you have to do is make sure that they discipline, they control what the public does. And after the Alaska earthquake, the Anchorage Police Department, they deputized a bunch of civilians to go out and patrol the streets to prevent this swarms of looters that they expected would, be breaking into the damaged shops and stuff. Of course, that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was people organized themselves into rescue parties, and they found people and they saved people. So we're seeing a lot of that happen in North Carolina. There's been a little bit of the elite panic. There was one case where a private helicopter pilot he found a guy and his wife stranded in their home where the road was washed out. He sat down. He was fine with his son. He left his son behind so that he could carry the guy's wife to safety. And then when he landed, a local police fire official said, "You can't fly back there. You can't go pick up that other guy, or we're going to arrest you." And so he did go back and pick up his son, but he had to tell the husband, "No, you're stuck up here for a while." So that story got a lot of attention, rightly so. I actually think it was fairly isolated. For the most part, these private relief efforts seem to be moving forward. A few cases where authorities tried to, mark roads as being closed because they are, dangerous. But mostly we're seeing very resourceful people using the tools and resources they have, ATVs and four-wheel drives. And I saw a video of one guy with a couple of donkeys carrying supplies up a washed-out road. So there's a lot going on.
Let me ask you about
positive.
that. You mentioned the article you mentioned, because that's something that's been on my mind, because you wrote that article in the age of COVID, right? And so it was putting what we were seeing in context. So I wanted to ask
just at the very, very, very beginning of COVID. Like I'm looking at it right now.
I was writing it like in March
It was in
of
our
2020.
May 2020 issue. So that means that we closed it literally like 2 weeks after lockdown began. I mean, and so this book had been published about the Alaskan earthquake and this remarkable radio broadcaster, Jeannie Chance, and her role in basically becoming the lead voice in how to rescue people during this earthquake when you could no longer rely on federal officials, and how this prediction of the elite panic that we could not even have known how severe the elite panic was going to be in the case of COVID, and how little we could trust the authorities that everybody was turning to for comfort and succor and help.
And that's what I'm wondering is Jim, the idea of misinformation, how much of this is wrapped up in a lost sense of trust of the authorities from COVID now. You wrote that at the beginning of COVID, but now we're on the other side of this, the predictions of elite panic and stuff. How has COVID affected what people trust and who they listen to in a hurricane like this?
That is a perfect question, Seth. Yeah, that was right at the beginning of COVID. I didn't yet know how dishonest and unreliable our public health officials would be, how they would cover up the lab leak thing, how they would stick to false claims that that the virus was not passed through the air, and many other things where there was a lot of elite panic in the sense of wanting to control the actions of people. I mean, one person got arrested for watching the sunset on a beach in California. A guy paddleboarding got arrested by himself out in a lagoon. So there was a lot of that during COVID. It was also the birth of the sort of modern sense of misinformation and disinformation, where anytime the government wanted to shut down a discussion, they would label it disinformation. And as we now know, the White House and CDC and others were calling and emailing their contacts at the major social media companies literally daily, telling them, you should take down this story, you should suppress that story, this story is disinformation. Some of what they were pointing to probably was, but a lot of it was just legitimate discussion of what COVID policy should be, and there's school lockdowns a good idea. Do we need masks? And of course, the government shouldn't be in a position of trying to censor material, regardless of its accuracy, I believe. But this is where a lot of that came from. And as you say, this is also where the period where the public lost a lot of trust in official sources of information. So of course people are going to turn to social media, and of course some bad actors are going to exploit that and spread fake news or other inaccurate claims. So we're in a position where it's a bit of a mess. There is a lot of weird conspiracy stuff floating around out there, but the efforts to suppress that or control that, I think, make the problem even worse.
There's an interesting federalism thing, too, that always strikes me when there's a major disaster like this. Having grown up in Florida and experienced many hurricanes, it's your state and local officials. It's your governor and it's your local officials who you really want to listen to. It's your local weather forecasters often. If you follow local weather in Florida right now, it's much calmer than the kind of insanity of the Weather Channel or any of the national news stories that are covering the storm. It's a very serious storm. When the mayor of Tampa says to the residents in that area, if you stay, you will die. And that now applies, unfortunately, to Bradenton, Sarasota area, since it looks like it might make landfall a little further south of Tampa Bay. But DeSantis has been doing an excellent job. Look, he did well with Helene. He's preparing everybody for Milton. He gives these daily briefings. He says what's going on. And it struck me as being resonant of a lot of what happened during COVID, too, to what you're saying, Jim, where certain governors, certain states had a way of going about things, had a way of discussing what was happening. We're a little more direct and straightforward. And we're not expecting people to want to be rescued by the federal government anytime anything happened. If you listen to the stories of Floridians, they'll say, look, I don't need FEMA here tomorrow. I need, to know how to evacuate. We need this, we need that. This idea, this narrative that I think the national media loves, which is the federal government has abandoned the citizens of New Orleans because it is racist because of George W. Bush, or the federal government is doing everything it possibly can because Biden is president. That fits into this idea that this isn't a local issue for most people. If you go to Florida, you're at risk of hurricanes. That's kind of baked into the zip codes there. So but I do think the national media likes this idea of the federal government should come in and rescue everyone from everything. It should also tell everyone how to live their lives.
Okay, but that, by the way, that's a double-edged sword. And this is where the double-edged sword comes in. Of course, it was fantastic for Democrats going into 2006. In 2005, when Katrina happened, that they were able to kind of lay this at the feet of the Bush administration, which had already started losing public trust because of the failure to secure either a victory or stability in Iraq. And there was a midterm election in which the Democrats kind of slaughtered the Republicans coming up, some of it on the grounds of like incompetence rather than ideology, that they could sort of de-ideologize it and say they just don't know what they're doing. They stink at this. They suck at this, and give us a chance, basically. Here's the story that is dangerous for politically for the Democrats who or liberals or whoever who do have this bias that the response needs to be top down, because that's the only way to make sure that it's equitable and that if people get the resources, that it's the only force that can distribute and all of that, is that we then read, as we read on Monday in a pretty startling story in the New York Times, that FEMA claims that it does not have any personnel to spare, that it's run out of people, and that it's run out of money. And why is it run out of people and run out of money? Well, there are two reasons, one of which is that apparently Democratic governors and FEMA and Biden and all of that are incredibly promiscuous about what they call a national emergency and what they then dedicate resources to. Somebody says, oh my God, a river overflowed somewhere in Iowa, we better do something. And there's a FEMA response and they send 40 people to do something or other. And you do that 40 times over. And suddenly you have FEMA personnel all over the country doing stuff. And then when you need them, they're not there. When you need them to be in place to deal with a gigantic emergency, which is what FEMA is supposed to, it's an emergency response agency. It's not
This is also another byproduct of COVID, I think, by the way. After COVID, the impulse to declare emergencies, to shut things down, to close school for weather, that became a sort of commonplace. There was that. I think that's part of the sort of power intoxication of being able to do that on that scale that we saw.
But here's the danger.
COVID.
So they don't have money, according to Alejandro Mayorkas, right? The Homeland Security says, we're out of money. We need you to give us more money. Okay. I'm sure that'll happen. It'll take 3 months, whatever. But then the question is, where did the money go in the first place? And this is the danger, because emergency management FEMA money was repurposed to help resettle border overflow migrants. And for example, some of the money that New York got from the federal government to help house migrants in New York came from FEMA. So let us just take a giant box, put a nice piece of wrapping paper around it with a big bow, and just hand it to Donald Trump. Because if Donald Trump can successfully say FEMA couldn't do its job because they were using money to resettle illegal immigrants elsewhere in the United States, rather than saving it to help Americans genuinely at risk of their lives in Florida, in Georgia, in North Carolina. Oh boy. Now, Trump's
and it's
skill
also
at that kind of argumentation is not great, and the media will do everything it can to interfere with the promotion of that story. But if it's true, it's pretty hard, and there's a month till the election. It's pretty hard for that not to start filtering down through the ranks to the undecided voters.
It's also, I just want to add, not incidentally, a genuine outrage in itself, regardless of what Trump can do.
Yeah, right. No, but I'm just saying politically, there's the weirdness of the behavior of Harris over the last week, and Biden. So fine, they say they don't want to go there because to go there is to intrude, and they don't need us there to make trouble. Whatever. Please, can she go and stand there and say, I'm just here in solidarity? Yes, she can. For 3 hours. Or she can actually go to 3 places and stand there and say something and then leave and just say, I care about you. Whatever. That's not going to cause an incredible disruption in the relief efforts. So you got to figure something else is going on there, which is they just don't understand how the politics plays. They're nervous about how the politics plays. They don't know how close they want to get to the response. Does this cause her to have a moment where she says, heck of a job, Brownie, to some local FEMA official or some local official who it turns out stole the money or something like that 2 weeks later? You just don't know how it plays. And so the incredible caution of the Harris campaign is playing a role there, because Trump, of course, did go to Valdosta, Georgia, and did make an appearance somewhere or other to, hand something out and say he cared about them. How effective that was or not politically, but he did it.
I wouldn't be surprised, though,
a little bit.
I wouldn't be surprised if part of the thinking on the part of the Harris campaign here is that it's so hard to compete with Trump on that ground because he's very comfortable in those settings with those people, and she is not at all. And there may be a certain degree of, look, that's his. We're not. That's a game we're not going to win. So let's try to talk about the framing. Let's beat up DeSantis and try some other things here.
There's also the what I call the Charles Barkley effect, which is, when I was a kid, there were these commercials where Larry Bird and Michael Jordan were playing horse, and I think it was probably a McDonald's commercial actually, and they
nothing but net.
Yeah, they would float. At one point, they would even be floating through space, right? And they're playing horse and hitting these shots. And Charles Barkley was always would creep up afterwards and say, "Can I play, guys?" And they would always sort of ignore. He was the third wheel. When they were in space, he would float up behind. Can I play, guys? The Charles Barkley effect is there's a president, there's a governor, and that's it, right? Joe Biden and Ron DeSantis, let's say if we're talking about Florida and the recent news about Sarasota and everything, if it's North Carolina, there's a governor. If it's Georgia, there's a governor. There's a president and a governor. And Kamala risks sort of sticking her head in the side, from the side, like going, "Can I play?" and looking kind of small, I think, in if it comes off that way.
Which she did in her kind of petty complaints about, this idea that DeSantis wasn't taking her calls. That didn't land. But I have a prediction. We were talking about whether the Trump camp can take these revelations about FEMA money being diverted to the migrant crisis and really use that politically. I think there's a gift coming for the Biden administration and the Harris campaign, and it's called Hurricane Milton. That will change the media spotlight away from what's going on in Western North Carolina, and this will become the dominant story for, I guess, the hurricane's due to land
overnight tonight.
Thursday or
tonight. Yeah.
Okay.
Early hours of the morning. And
early hours
Wednesday
tomorrow
night,
morning.
early Thursday. Yeah.
And so that will become the main focus. It looks like a huge hurricane. It'll have a lot of impact. Just as they did last time a hurricane hit Florida, the press will look for any example of what they can call incompetence, to lay at the feet of DeSantis. That'll be hard because his team seems to be really good at this. But they'll look for that, and they'll also switch the storyline, as you mentioned, John, to climate change. This is climate change in action. This is why we can't trust Republicans because they're not serious about climate change. I'm seeing some of that coverage already. So the climate crisis story, that this is the new reality, massive hurricanes every month, that will be the story that dominates the media for the next couple of weeks. And that will take that'll deflate some of the political sort of salience of whatever. And again, I think the idea that FEMA has terribly screwed up in its response to Helene is somewhat overblown, but there are definitely cases where FEMA was slow or, not on the ball. But that story will fade, and this other story will dominate the mainstream media. And I think that is, sometimes bad news is good news if you have a story you want to get off the front page.
But it's still a hurricane story, and it still raises the question of the federal response and FEMA and the money.
But it won't be about the federal response this time.
Okay.
It's about Florida's response. Why isn't Florida doing all this stuff?
Fair enough. Okay. I mean, we also don't know where Milton's going to go because it's going to hit Florida.
It's going
to hit Florida.
It's going to either be Tampa, St. Pete, Bradenton, or Sarasota. I mean, it's just going to go across the state.
Then it can turn.
But it looks like it's going to blow straight across the state.
It looks like it'll go out. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So
look at the spaghetti. It's the spaghetti models. You have to try. I'm obsessed with the spaghetti models. You got to watch this.
Fair enough. Okay. I think that we're showing how unbelievably ill-served we are as an electorate by the fact that both the Trump and Harris campaigns are getting away with this fact that they're not going to debate again, or that there aren't going to be, there's not going to be another major moment where, 50 million Americans can watch somebody ask people questions about this or about what's going on and see how they respond. It's very important to see how they respond. And that's one of the virtues of the Harris media blitz, is that she clearly felt that it was necessary. She could not stay in the basement any longer. And she has, I think, done herself some harm, but she probably has also done herself some good simply by being there, by making news, by being in the news, which you would think you'd want, because you're trying to get people to come out and vote for you, and hiding from them is not the greatest thing on earth. And Trump's kind of hiding from people also. I mean, he's about to have some events today, later this afternoon on Wednesday in Pennsylvania. But, it's not like he's 7 days a week, out there pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. He's not the same relentless person that he was before. And major things are going on. Israel's going to hit Iran. And, the news, if Harris can't trump it, so to speak, next week is going to be this Bob Woodward book, which is apparently going to be about how incredibly incompetent Biden was dealing with Ukraine, and from the liberal perspective, Israel, in how wars are being handled during the Biden administration. And that is, we're only seeing little teeny bits of news from it this week. The book comes out next Tuesday. And Harris is going to have to answer for that too, if she was in the room when every decision was made. And so that's why I don't know. She is like, there are bills coming due, all through the month of October. And it just seems like it's not clear to me that they have any idea how they're going to write the checks to cover the bills. It's clear to me that they know that they have a candidate in Trump who is very unpopular and seems to have a ceiling, and that, if they can just edge him out, they'll win. They just need to edge him out. And so they're sort of running a sort of edge him out strategy or something like that. But Jim, let's let me just ask you about another person who is worthy of discussion, since we mentioned climate change and you've written about her in commentary and the Greta Thunberg story, because I want to bring up something about Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, of course, the Joan of Arc of climate change, 16-year-old girl leading worldwide pressure about the horrors of climate. Nominated for Nobel Prizes, speaks at the UN, whatever. I can't even remember how this all happened, but it just all happened. And now I guess she's 21. And somehow she has morphed from being a climate change activist into being an almost open radical anti-Semitic opponent of Israel. And I say not anti-Zionist, but like actually anti-Semitic, her rhetoric, her talk, or all this. Can we glean something from the fact that she has taken this journey from one to the other?
Well, it's not much of a journey. These movements are part of what some have called the omni cause. This kind of overlapping conglomeration of left-wing causes, which all kind of come down to a radical sort of post-Marxist notion that everything wrong in the world is the fault of Western civilization. The Enlightenment was the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. And we really need to fight against capitalism, against Western styles of government, against the peoples that pioneered, the Enlightenment movement, and these values. And what we've seen with all these these campus protests and everything recently is, while they're all wearing masks, in a sense, the mask is off. Their enemy is not just what goes on in the West Bank or settlements or Israeli policies. It's Western civilization. I mean, when they say globalize the Intifada, they really mean, let's have bus bombs going off in every major Western capital. That would be great. So how is that related to climate change? Well, deep down, leaving aside the science of climate change, which I think is real, if overblown by some advocates, but leaving that aside, what drives a lot of climate advocates is this sense that Western civilization was a mistake. We should all go back to some kind of Rousseauian, agrarian, communitarian lifestyle where we share food, and maybe everyone's got a little solar panel on their charming little hut, with natural spun linen clothing and all that kind of stuff. It's
I'm itching already.
It's a very appealing fantasy, and you see it in a lot of left-wing environmentalism. You certainly see it in Europe in the anti-nuclear movement of the German Green Party. Anything modern, anything high-tech is suspect. Anything tied to capitalism is suspect. So for Greta Thunberg to go from climate catastrophism to rabid anti-Israel, anti-Semitic political advocacy doesn't surprise me a bit, because those causes have always been closely aligned, and they both reflect a deeper, broader goal, which is really, I think we need to take this seriously. When these people say they support these movements, they don't just mean that they think, Israel's in the wrong, or we've got the wrong party in power in this country or that country. They really mean the whole system has to come down. They really, maybe in a vague way, they believe in a global revolution. They keep telling us this, and people don't believe them. But that's really what they mean. And she is very much more openly coming out for that.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself, which is why I wanted you to say it, because you said it better than I could have said it. Jim Meigs, thank you so much for being with us. I think we'll skip the commentary recommends today because I don't have one, and we haven't.
We could recommend
who has
maintaining Western civilization. How's that?
Yes.
Let's keep it.
Yes. Western
good today.
civilization.
And Jim's essay that we talked about. Jim's essay.
Well, that's exactly a great idea. His essay, which we will link to somehow, Elite Panic versus the Resilient Populace. One of my favorite pieces that I published in my now almost 16-year tenure as the editor of Commentary, and really a remarkable account of what it means to be kind of a conservative, or at least a Tocquevillian American, and why reliance on the central government is something that we have fallen into in a terribly self-destructive way, when what we really need to do is believe in ourselves and each other and the ability of community to be salvatory as opposed to top-down solutions. Anyway, so Jim, thanks so much for being with us. And you can read him in the pages of Commentary. You can read him in the pages of the City Journal, where he writes as part of his brief at the Manhattan Institute. And for Christine, Seth, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.